At long, long last, it is done. Now, I don't know when exactly I'll have time to edit and upload this episode, but at the time of recording, Alien Biospheres Part 14 was released a couple of weeks ago, and my god, it is so surreal to think that it's finally finished. Because, if you'll indulge me for a second, I cannot put into words how much I have been looking forward to this episode for the past 3 or 4 years now. Because I knew from the very beginning that the mass extinction was going to be the big, epic climax. The plan, from the get-go, was to use the first however many episodes to introduce the basic principles of evolutionary biology and flesh out a manageably sized biosphere to just get across the principles that we're talking about, and then, in the penultimate episode, to kill off basically everything, to wipe the slate clean, so that now we can rebuild the world and go into a lot more detail than we had before. And now that we've established all of the necessary groundwork, I can make the world how I want it to be, rather than how it needs to be. So after all these years of making all these Alien Biospheres episodes, knowing full well that the vast majority of clades I'm making are going to die, I've been hyping this up in my mind for so long, and I'm very pleased to say that the episode came out pretty much exactly as I was hoping it would. And even though it's by far the longest episode, it was still one of the most enjoyable episodes to make. So I'm very, very happy about that. And thank you to all of the patrons for bearing with me during this time. And now there's only one episode left to make. And after that, I can finally go back to making videos of a reasonable length. No more hour-long videos that take the better part of a year to put together. Now I can just make nice, concise, 10-minute long videos on much more specific topics, which I will be able to make with much greater frequency. And I suppose this is kind of a minor spoiler, but I think just about everyone's seen this coming by this point. Yes, there will eventually be alien conlangs. Part of the reason why I started Alien Biospheres in the first place is because I got a bunch of requests for a video about alien languages. And in order to do that, I need an alien that is capable of language. But we will deal with all of that in due course. For now, it's time to finally return to this language. So, when we last left off, it would have been sometime in November, I think? Yes, it must have been, because I was about to start Lexemba. And Lexemba went very well, I think. Generated a whole bunch of new words. And if you want to see the full list, if you go to my community posts, you might have to scroll back a bit, but you should be able to find them. So we've added a little bit over 30 words to our lexicon. But the process of coining these words also helped me identify several things that need to be tended to. So today we have a whole bunch of stuff to catch up on. First of all, I have some pretty big but still kind of tentative changes. I think we might be a little bit late in the game to make these sorts of changes, but I don't think it's too late. So first of all, I genuinely can't remember if I've talked about this at all before this point, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but I have become increasingly bothered with the way that we've had vowel combinations reduced to monophthongs, specifically with how they tend to reduce to short vowels. I can't remember specifically why I made that decision, but the more I think about it, the less sense it makes, and the more I think that if it does come from two separate segments, then it should result in a long vowel. That seems kind of unavoidable to me. I mean, I suppose what might have led me to make it a short vowel is the idea that one of the two vowels is going to reduce to a glide first, and if the glide is in onset position, then when it merges with the following vowel, that probably won't lead to any kind of change in length, because usually when onsets are lost, that doesn't result in any compensatory lengthening, or compensatory, or however you want to pronounce it. Like if you had a sequence like yin, if that Y were to assimilate into the I think there would be no issue with having it remain short and just be in, rather than een. But if the glide is in coda position, I really do think that that would have the effect of lengthening the preceding vowel as the glide disappears. Especially if vowel length was already a feature that the language was paying attention to before this point. It just seems so inevitable that that would be interpreted as a long vowel. The only downside to that is that it makes it slightly harder to generate short front-rounded vowels. In fact, by this point, there wouldn't be any short front-rounded vowels, because they would necessarily come from two segments. But then in the following sound change, we get short front-rounded vowels following palatal consonants, so that's okay. So I have gone back through the lexicon and tweaked some of the vowel lengths here and there, where there would realistically be a long vowel from two previous short vowels coming in contact with each other. However, I do still think we can fudge it a little bit when it comes to word boundaries and affixation. Like when a word becomes a clitic and shortens up into an affix. Like a word that ends in a vowel, followed by a clitic that begins with a vowel. I don't think that vowel length need necessarily be paid attention to at that boundary. I'm trying to think of a decent example, but I know for a fact that there are plenty of languages where if you have some vowel initial suffix that you attach to a word that ends in a vowel, you don't always get a long vowel or diphthong as a result. One of the two vowels will just sort of win out. Or in Latin, when you have the word est, which is just the third person copula, it is, when that cliticizes onto something else, a lot of the time it essentially just comes across as an st suffix. Like if you say something like magna est, which means it is big, a lot of the time it'll just come out as magnast. And as far as I'm aware, there's no effect on the length of that a, even though the e has been elided into it. So yeah, between word boundaries, we've still got some freedom. However, that being said, the reason why we gave the dative ending the form that we did, specifically the fact that it's disyllabic, is because we wanted it to shift the stress back, which is why we noted this thing that the dative never removes the final vowel of the stem. But I'm starting to think that a simpler, cleaner way of doing that would just be to say that the vowel in that suffix is long. That way the stress will always fall on the oo vowel, and it's guaranteed to have a different stress pattern than either the accusative or the locative. And really that wouldn't change very much, because most of the time with this never removing the stem's final vowel, it ultimately just becomes a long vowel anyway, but I think that might just be a simpler, cleaner way of doing it. Now, I mentioned a second ago about the potential difficulty of generating short front-rounded vowels. I found that to very much be the case when I was coming up with forms for Lexemba. Whenever I wanted to generate a front-mid-rounded vowel, it was frustratingly difficult at times to get a front-rounded mid-vowel. And so I came to the conclusion that it's just a little bit too fiddly to rely just on either uvulas or pharyngeals for vowel lowering. And so, and I appreciate this is a pretty drastic change, but I decided to amend the phonology of the proto-lang to give us what I'm tentatively labeling as adjectives. It almost doesn't really matter what their exact realization is, but essentially I want some consonants that can trigger vowel lowering in other places of articulation aside from uvula and pharyngeal. That way we can just get a lot more mid-vowels in a lot more places, and then just have the adjectives, or whatever they end up being, merging with their regular non-ejective counterparts later. So that's just going to make getting those O's and Is a hell of a lot easier. So since we're adding basically a whole new sound series to our proto-lang, I have started going back through and fitting in these adjectives when I can, because obviously the proto-lang is going to make pretty healthy use of them. I've also, at this point, just said that these adjective sounds only exist among voiceless stops, because I really don't want to have to go in and add, implosives or ejective fricatives or pharyngealized consonants and go and completely change up how the phonology works. I think just having this small set should be enough. While I'm at it, I've also been thinking about maybe changing the syllable structure of the proto-lang, because we'd said that only resonants can serve as coders, and sometimes it's just a little bit difficult to make a form come out the way I want it to with that restriction, so I might maybe change it to say that, like, fricatives are also allowed to serve as coders, but I definitely haven't committed to that yet. So we'll see how it goes as we play around with some more forms. I also decided to change the verb for to do or make, this very semantically weak verb that's giving us the possessive classifier for what I'm calling accomplishments for the time being. Before, we were using nama for that, which I still like and will still use as another classifier probably, but for such a simple, semantically weak word, I just felt like something a little bit shorter was needed. So now I've got this form that was just hu in the proto-lang, which for most of these possessive classifiers just comes out as an H. And one more thing before we get into the main topic I want to talk about. Just something that occurred to me as I was making some of these words for Lexemba. So, I definitely envisioned this language having compounds, partially just because I unabashedly love compounding. It just makes so many things so much easier, and unless it's specifically a design goal to not use compounding, like it was in Okolawak, then I'm definitely going to find a way to squeeze in compounding wherever I can. However, in this language we have an interesting situation when it comes to compounding. So just taking a random word here, this word vaharkallo, which means reptile, and is literally just a compound of lizard and beast or creature or animal, so it's a lizard animal. But the question is, what happens if we try and pluralize that? Because the head of the compound is kallo, and the nominative plural of kallo is kyllis. So that part is pretty much non-negotiable. But the question is, what happens to vahar? Because we have to remember that in this language, the singular and plural forms of the different classes actually came from distinct classifiers. They would have been treated as separate genders, effectively, in the proto-lang. Kind of like Swahili or the other Bantu languages, where there's like 18, 20 classes, but they tend to come in singular plural pairs. And in fact, in Swahili, when you pluralize a compound, both elements have to be pluralized. So following that logic, vahar would also need to be in the plural form, and the plural of vahar is vahras. So the plural of vaharkallo would either be vaharkyllis or vahraskullis. And I don't really know if either one of those is more or less likely than the other. I don't know if it's just happenstance that compounds work like that in the Bantu languages. Because I don't know much about German, but I do know that in German compounds, the gender or plurality of the head has no effect on any of the compounded elements. So I think either of those would be justifiable, but I don't know which is more likely, if there's some secret thing that I don't know about that affects which one the language will favor, nor do I really know which one I prefer at this point. Because I kind of like the idea that both elements need to become plural, but at the same time that might introduce some additional sort of fiddliness and might limit just how crazy we can get with compounds if you need to change every individual element whenever you do it. I don't know. I'm going to keep thinking about that, but if anyone has any input or opinions, or especially any relevant sources on such things, do let me know. Right, now we proceed to the main event, because this language, by this point, I think it's pretty safe to say that we've hit critical mass. We've got a pretty solid idea of how our verbs are working, what's going on with our nouns, adpositions, all of that stuff. But the one thing that we have not yet sorted out, the thing that we're absolutely begging for at this point, is adjectives. Because so far we have barely even mentioned adjectives, other than just coming up with the forms used in comparison just on a whim. So it's about time we actually get some adjectives properly done and codified. So now, let me tell you of the decision-making process that I am grappling with. And I know for a fact that I have said at least some of what I'm about to say before, but I honestly can't remember how much, and it's probably best to just have a refresher anyway. So, the crux of the issue is that typically, in any given language, adjectives, or the word class that fills the function of adjectives, will collectively tend to behave either like nouns or like verbs. And that's typically because they ultimately derive from either nouns or verbs. So if an adjective is noun-like, that will typically mean that when it's used predicatively, like the dog is big, it will demand some sort of verb be in the sentence, in this case the copula is, because it will not be able to stand on its own as a predicate. Whereas if you have a verb-like adjective, then if the adjective is already acting as a verb, then it can just stand on its own. So you would say the equivalent of the dog bigs. So in some cases, a verb-like adjective could be basically indistinguishable from a stative verb. You just have a verb that means to be such and such, and there you go. Now, I personally have always found that verb-like adjectives are so much easier to work with than noun-like adjectives. For two reasons. One, it's just a lot easier to come up with etymologies for verb-like adjectives. Because if you have an adjective like, I don't know, proud, or ostentatious or something, perfectly justifiable to have a verb that means to be proud. Or if you wanted to, you could come up with some way of deriving it from some other meaning. But in any case, it's pretty straightforward. Whereas with a noun-like adjective, it's generally a lot harder to think of a noun meaning that can end up being interpreted with the desired adjectival meaning. And the second reason is that if adjectives are verb-like, that means they can take at least some of the morphology that verbs usually take, which means it's a hell of a lot easier to handle things like participles, or, for example, if you had a verb-like adjective that meant to be big, and you wanted to causativize that meaning, to make a verb that means to cause something else to be big, to enlarge. Well, if the adjective is verb-like, and the language already has a way of causativizing verbs, then you can just slap the causative on it, and there you go. You get a verb that means to enlarge. And then, if you want to turn that into some sort of passive participle, like if you want to say, the enlarged house, the house that has been made bigger, then all you have to do is stick a passive on that, and there you go. Very straightforward. Whereas to do that, starting with a noun as a base, becomes a lot trickier to conceptualize how to make something like that work. So I have always preferred using verb-like adjectives. However, I have said that for this language I would like to try going with noun-like adjectives. Number one, just for the sake of variety, just because I've predominantly relied on verb-like adjectives for every single other conlang I have, with the marginal exception of Nakachti and Adun, because they do have a subclass of noun-like adjectives as well. In fact, even then, in Adun, the noun-like adjectives are actually just noun roots that have been incorporated into the copula, so they're still technically verb-like. But I wanted to see if I could do a proper go at true noun-like adjectives in this language. And really, the main thing is that I'd like adjectives to agree with the nouns they modify in case, because I have never done that before. And conceptually, theoretically, I really like the idea of adjectives agreeing with case. However, the issue presents itself when the more I work on these declension tables, and the more I look at how these case endings are turning out, I'm not actually sure I like the idea of case agreement from a purely phonesthetic standpoint. Like, if the suffix is just a single vowel or something, that's fine. But in some of these heavier forms, if both the adjective and the noun have to take this irin ending, I just get the feeling that that could get very old very fast. So I am a little bit cautious of the idea, whereas if we went with verb-like adjectives, then effectively, as it seems to me at this moment, they would essentially function like our possessive classifiers do, where you have a verb root and then you attach these pronominal prefixes. So they would agree with the noun in number and gender, but not in case. And keep in mind that agreeing with gender is basically mandatory, because the thing that defines a gender system in the first place is agreement. If there's no agreement, then it's not gender. So we kind of have to have some agreement morphology. In fact, thinking about it now, our verbs do agree in gender with the subject, but I don't think I've ever seen a language that has verbs that agree in gender, but not adjectives that agree in gender. That's interesting. If someone has, let me know. But regardless, one way or another, I definitely want to have adjectives agreeing in gender in this language. That's non-negotiable. So I do prefer the idea of verb-like adjectives from a phonesthetic standpoint. One small thing that's giving me pause is I do kind of like having these possessive classifiers be effectively their own word class. They don't really function like any other part of speech, and to just make that the default way that all adjectives work makes them a little bit less special, but I don't think that's a deal breaker. But then there's another factor we have to consider. Like I just said a moment ago, one of the big perks of having verb-like adjectives is that they can take the same sort of morphology as verbs can. But in this language, we've got two distinct, separate verbal elements. We've got the auxiliary, and then we've got the principal parts. And if we're using verb-like adjectives after the manner of the possessive classifiers, the possessive classifiers are structured much more similarly to the auxiliary, in terms of the fact that they actually take subject agreement, and they don't have distinct principal parts. So it would seem to me that they would only take the sorts of morphology that the auxiliary takes, whereas the causative and the passive occurs on the lexical verb, not the auxiliary. So even if we do go with verb-like adjectives, it's not going to be as simple as all that. We're still going to have to find a way to make all of these different verbal meanings mesh. And that's not even getting into the fact that even if we do decide to go full-blown noun-like adjectives all the way, there will still be some form of participle or participle-like construction by which you can take a verb meaning and turn it into an adjective. Like if you wanted to say something like, the sleeping dog. Here, sleeping is being used as an adjective to modify dog, but it's very clearly the verb sleep with a suffix on it. So the language will almost certainly have a way of taking basically any verb form and turning it into an adjective to modify any specific noun. But even if that is a strategy, it may not necessarily be the preferred one. Or, even if the language exclusively uses noun-like adjectives, even when it uses a verb in a participle, the process of turning it into a participle may make it noun-like what happens in plenty of the Indo-European languages. Like in Latin, when you turn a verb into a participle, you add one of three endings, one for the past, one for the present, and one for the future, and then you attach case marking. So the process of using verbs as adjectives inherently makes them noun-like, and forces them to take case agreement. And honestly, I still don't really understand how that came about from a diachronic perspective. I've spent many hours going through rabbit holes about this, about the origin and lexical sources of participles in the Indo-European languages. And there's some strange things going on that I can't quite wrap my head around, and I don't think it's fully known exactly where some of this stuff comes from. So basically, the point is, we need to decide whether or not we're going with noun-like adjectives or verb-like adjectives, and, regardless of which of those we choose, we're also going to need a potentially separate strategy for turning verbs into participles. Because the only other options I can think of would be, one, we say that adjectives are their own separate class that diverged from nouns and verbs before the proto-lang. They were already their own distinct thing. And I don't want to do that because, again, we want agreement to happen, and that only really makes sense if adjectives are already associated with either nouns or verbs. And the other option is to say that there are actually two distinct classes of adjectives, one noun-like and one verb-like, that coexist. Which I'm not sure I want to do because I did that in Nakachti, but if push comes to shove, we could invoke that, I guess. At least it would work a fair bit differently than it does in Nakachti, because in Nakachti the noun-like adjectives are actually basically nouns that just got appended with various case markers, usually the genitive, because in Nakachti the case markers are basically kind of verbs in and of their own right. It's complicated. Whereas here, what I can see maybe happening is if we say that the noun-like adjectives are the older class. There was one point in time in which all adjectives were noun-like, but then slowly these verb-like adjectives have become increasingly prevalent, which may or may not also be associated with the rise of these possessive classifiers, because in that case these possessive classifiers would technically be verb-like adjectives in their own right. So there's this shift that happens as the language evolves, where more and more of these verb-like adjectives are added, but you do still have this old core class of noun-like adjectives that convey a lot of the more common and more basic meanings. So, that is where we're at. That's what we've got to think about. And so I think at this point the best way to address this issue is to coin a couple of sample noun-like and verb-like adjectives and just play around with them. And that should give us some more data to make a firm decision. So I think I'm going to start out with a verb-like adjective because I think that's going to be a fair bit easier. Because it occurs to me we do already have some verb meanings that lend themselves very well to becoming verb-like adjectives, like this word that means to be sick. So if we take the protoform for that, and then we just run it through pretty much exactly the way we've been doing to these possessive classifiers, let's just see what we get. So yeah, that I think would be pretty straightforward. It would just be a question of attaching the correct pronominal prefix. So the only other way I can immediately think of for verb-like adjectives to behave is to say that the principal parts themselves can also function as participles. They can be used both adverbially and adjectivally. So myken could mean either while being sick, or in the manner of being sick, or just sick, if it just preposed a noun. And I think I mentioned in my converbs video a while back, I recall seeing there are some languages that have this thing that's sometimes called an adverbial participle that basically fills, the function of both an adverb and an adjective. So I guess it's not out of the question, but the problem, yet again, is that doing that would yield no agreement. So if we wanted agreement, this would kind of have to be the way to go. But these would only be used attributively and not predicatively. Because if you wanted to get across the sense of, like, the man is sick, then you would just conjugate the verb in the normal way. Use the correct principal part, auxiliary, and all that. In which case, I don't think that the non-third person forms would actually see any usage, unless this language was okay applying adjectives to first and second person pronouns, which I have seen that happen every now and then. I actually don't know how common that is cross-linguistically. Like how common it is to say something like, I see sick you. I see you who are sick. So, just for a sort of proof of concept, let's just try an example sentence. Let's take a human and an animate noun. Let's go with irmai, which I had conceptualized as the word for leopard, but I was thinking that would also serve as the basis for other kinds of big cats. Like a tiger would be like a striped leopard or something. And how about the word for friend, which is lich? What's a good transitive verb? How about to feed? That's simple enough. So if we wanted to say, the sick friend is feeding the sick leopard, keeping it simple and saying that the verb's in the present tense, then we need the first principal part and form one of the human singular auxiliary. So then friend is the subject, so it'll be in the nominative, whereas irmai will be in the accusative. So that's the friend is feeding the leopard, but both the friend and the leopard are sick. So the human singular form for the friend, so it would be Vamulka luch vai amulka irmaias kamaskan. That's kind of an artificial example, but still you see the change in form for the adjective. And I do kind of like how gender is marked by a suffix on the noun but a prefix on the adjective. So that's pretty straightforward. But now let's try the noun-like situation. First of all, as I had said in a previous episode, I do like the idea that adjectives had become their own separate class before the evolution of the dual and the singulative. Both because that makes them a little bit more distinct from nouns, but also the dual tends to be pretty heavy in terms of marking, like these yunlu and orle and these other quite lengthy endings that would be kind of a pain to have on both the adjective and the noun. So the paradigm for noun-like adjectives would look something like this. So it would be all the same sorts of endings that nouns usually take. So now to come up with some sort of form for it. I do like this form kulken, which sounds kind of like kulka, which, if I'm remembering correctly, is the Okalawak word for labyrinthodont. But anyway, I was originally going to use this as a verb form, but I'm going to try it out as a noun-like adjective. So if we say that the protoform is kuilku, let's run that through these endings and see what we get. So it seems like, just with this particular form we happen to choose, a combination of vowel harmony and uvula coloring means that the human singular and animate singular forms are identical. And that's not a huge problem. That sort of syncretism happens all the time. And in fact, that's kind of interesting in its own right, of perhaps the human and animate classes are beginning to merge. I do think, though, that with that long vowel in the dative, that does lead to clunkier forms that I'm not too happy with. I'm going to have to keep thinking about that. But the big test is actually seeing how that works when applied to a noun. So if we just take this same example sentence we had earlier, and by the way, we still haven't actually given a meaning to this noun-like form. That almost doesn't matter at this point. Let's just say for the time being that it means old. We can easily imagine that there was some old noun root that meant something along the lines of old person or old thing, and then that just got turned into an adjective. So if we swap out sick for old, then the nominative singular for the human class, and the accusative singular for the animate class, Kylkölych vaikylkös irmaias kamaskan. So there's basically no assonance or shared morphology at all with the subject, which is kind of to be expected because the nominative is the unmarked case. Whereas the accusative, they both end in the S, but they're not overly similar to each other. However, if we pluralize it, the accusative plural, then it becomes kylkössu irmisse. That's not too bad. There's definitely some assonance going on, but it's not full-on rhyming like I was afraid it would. I suppose vowel harmony does help limit that to a degree. Just out of curiosity, what if we snuck in a locative? What if we took this word for city? Actually, no, that's not going to help much because it's inanimate, and therefore the locative is going to be the same as the nominative. Okay, let's try something else. How about river? Locative singular of river is buskern. So if we change it to the old friend is feeding the old leopards at the old river, then the locative singular, so we get the phrase Kylkön buskern. Again, it's not actually as distractingly similar as I feared it would be. That's good. But if we pluralize it, I suspect that's when we're going to run into some not so euphonic forms. So we get Kylkössin baskössin. Not great, but not as terrible as it could be. I don't know, it's still verging on acceptable. Okay, that does give me a ray of hope. Some more research is definitely required, but I think there may yet be some chance that noun-like adjectives could be our primary way to go. Sadly, I am running short on time for today. I don't think I'm going to bother coining a new noun this time round, because we have just spent ages coining this noun-like adjective. And plus, thanks to Lexemba, we've got a whole boatload of new nouns anyway. But let's put together one last example sentence. And for this one, I'd like to use both of the adjectives that we have, and I might also like to use one of these comparative forms. We've got old and we've got sick. And in fact, we do have this other stative verb to hunger, or to be hungry, which would lend itself very easily to being turned into a verb-like adjective. So old, sick, and hungry, which sounds like some sort of spin-off of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, this seems like a good opportunity to use some of my favourite words that we coined during Lexemba. First of all, I do love this word, Sichverian, which means volcano, is literally fire mountain. It's just such a nice sounding word. Sichverian. Very nice. And I also quite like this word as well, Eikaduk, which means temple, or more literally god house. We also have these two different words for to look for that have these slightly different senses, where kaikin comes from an old verb that means to hunt. They're just sort of generalized to mean to go out and gather or collect or look for, whereas a separate root for to travel took on this sense of meaning to try. And you can see how that would happen, because we can use the word venture in English kind of similarly. If you venture to do something, it means you're attempting to do it, but haven't necessarily achieved it yet. but then that same root also got appended with an applicative to give the sense of to travel towards or to seek for, to look for. So it means kind of the same thing as qayiqin, but it has more of a sense of a definite endpoint. Like you're looking for one thing in particular, and when you find it, you will be done. Whereas qayiqin is a bit more distributive. It's like an ongoing thing. So if we want to say something like, the eagle looks for lizards, as in it's hunting lizards, then yeah, you would definitely use qayiqin. Number one, obviously because of the lexical source, it literally comes from the verb to hunt, but also because it's not like the eagle finds one lizard and then it's done, and it will no longer look for lizards anymore. It's more of just a general ongoing thing. So how about the hungry eagle looks for sick lizards at the oldest temple on top of the, let's just throw in a sublative, why not? The least old volcano. And this sounds like some sort of old myth or legend to me, so why don't we make it remote past tense? Okay, step 1. Find out what combination of auxiliary and lexical verb we need. It's the remote past, so we need form 2 combined with the third principal part. The third principal part of the verb is qayarak. The subject is the hungry eagle, so that's animate singular, form 2, so that's So the subject is the eagle. The word for eagle is qardach, which, kind of like the word for leopard, is also applicable to other birds of prey, but the eagle is just sort of the general archetype of the bird of prey. But the eagle is hungry, so we take the verb for to be hungry, take the fourth principal part, and just apply the correct pronominal prefix, which is animate singular, and in this case that be would undergo lenition, so it would be avarda, so we end up with avarda kardach. Wow. Ironic that I was so worried about noun-like adjectives sounding too similar to their nouns, when just by sheer coincidence the verb-like adjective and the noun that I'm pairing it with happen to already sound so similar. But that's fine, we can roll with that. And the hungry eagle was looking for sick lizards. So we need lizard in the accusative plural, vachrisse, and the word for sick in the animate plural, tirmulqa. And then we have the oldest temple. So since the word for temple is just a compound of the word for house, we can just use the locative of the word for house. But do we want to use the indefinite number, or do we specifically want to use the singulative? Using the singulative here would have the meaning of, like, the one oldest temple. Like, I think that would give it some sort of emphatic weight that I kind of like. And then oldest, the locative singular in the inanimate gender for the word for old, but it's preceded by the superlative word, so it's old in the manner of defeating everything. Nothing else can beat it in terms of how old it is. And then finally, on top of the least old volcano. So our postposition for on top of is vak. Then the word for volcano is just fire mountain. And we might as well throw this one in the singulative as well. It's the one and only least old mountain. Then we need the word for old again, which isn't going to be different because it's in the same case. And then we take the sublative and apply that before the noun. And in fact, just for the hell of it, let's sneak in an excessive. The hungry eagle was looking for overly sick lizards, or too sick lizards, like lizards that were too sick to get away from it, presumably. Oh, I actually got it wrong here. The object needs to come before the verb. There we go. So now our final sentence would be Avarda kardach, si tuchre kulke sich verjanravak, samba kulke I kudakus, bayan tirmulke vachrisse kayarak. You see, now we're starting to put together sentences of some weight and meaning to them. It's all coming together. Okay, so if you have any thoughts about what we've discussed today, if you have any specific preferences or opinions or, as I say, resources about how these noun-like versus verb-like adjectives work, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I will continue to mull over it for the next while. I'm kind of trying to take it slow for a bit after part 14, so I don't know exactly when I'll be able to do the next one of these, but hopefully by then I will have made a decision about how exactly I want to proceed. So until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you then.